They say the greatest minds are often the most tortured. Before he became a saint, Augustine of Hippo was a man consumed by ambition, indulgence, and a relentless search for truth. He had everything a man could want: intelligence that outshined his peers, the admiration of Rome's elite, and a life of pleasure. But none of it satisfied him. Augustine was born in 354 AD in Thagast, North Africa, the son of a pagan father and a devout Christian mother, Saint Monica. From an early age, he was marked by brilliance. His education in rhetoric made him one of the most promising intellectuals of his generation. His teachers called him a genius. His peers envied his natural eloquence. But despite his gift for persuasion, he was a man at war with himself. His heart craved meaning, yet he sought it in all the wrong places. He pursued philosophy, hoping that reason alone could explain the mysteries of existence. But every system he studied left him with more questions than answers. He sought pleasure, immersing himself in a life of lust, taking mistresses, and fathering a child out of wedlock. He chased status, climbing the ranks of Roman society, believing that recognition and influence would finally bring him the fulfillment he longed for. But with every step, he felt more lost. Despite his outward success, Augustine was tormented by an inner void. The more he fed his desires, the hungrier they became. No philosophy could satisfy his restless soul, and no pleasure could quench the thirst in his heart. Desperate for truth, he turned to Manichaeism, a popular but heretical religious movement that promised secret knowledge and a dualistic view of the universe. Light against darkness, spirit against flesh. Its teachings seduced many brilliant minds of the time, offering intellectual complexity and a justification for sin. Augustine became a devoted follower, believing he had finally found wisdom. But his mother, Saint Monica, saw through the deception. A woman of unshakable faith, she had spent years praying for her son's salvation. She pleaded with him to turn to Christ, but he dismissed her concerns. In his mind, Christianity was too simple, too restrictive. He was too proud to accept it. And yet, doubt began to gnaw at him. Even the Manichaean priests could not answer the deepest questions of his soul. The contradictions of their teachings unsettled him, but he was too stubborn to admit he had been wrong. Then, one night, lying awake in despair, he confessed in his writings, "I was held fast, not by iron chains, but by the bondage of my own will." His mind knew the truth. He'd heard the teachings of Christ all his life, but his heart was enslaved by his desires. He wanted both the world and God, but he could not have both. Something had to break. For years, Augustine wandered through life, torn between the pursuit of truth and the pleasures that chained him. His intellect soared, yet his heart remained enslaved. Rome, the beating heart of civilization, had given him everything: wealth, reputation, and endless indulgence. And yet, despite standing among the empire's finest minds, he felt hollow. His fame as a rhetorician grew. His speeches captivated crowds, his arguments won favor in the courts, and the most powerful men sought his counsel. He had climbed higher than most could dream. But the higher he climbed, the further he fell into temptation. Augustine did not live like a saint. He lived like a man of the world. The city of Carthage, where he first studied, was a place of unchecked pleasure, and he gave himself to its desires. The young women of the city were easily swayed by his charm and wit, and he fell into many sinful affairs. But one woman, in particular, captivated him. Though history does not record her name, she was his mistress for over a decade, bearing him a son, Adeodatus. He loved her, yet he would not marry her. Marriage was beneath him. At least, that's what society told him. If he wanted to rise in the ranks of Roman aristocracy, he could not be tied to a woman of low birth. She was good enough for his bed, but not his name. So he kept her at arm's length, bound by lust, but refusing love. All the while, his mother, Saint Monica, watched in sorrow. She prayed fervently for him, weeping as only a mother can. She begged him to leave behind his sinful ways, but Augustine brushed her aside. He told himself he had time. He was young. The pleasures of life were his to enjoy. But deep inside, he knew he was losing control. His soul cried out for peace, yet he drowned it with distractions. When he was not feasting, he was drinking. When he was not drinking, he was entertaining philosophers, debating ideas, filling his mind with everything except what he truly needed: God. Still, Monica refused to give up. When Augustine told her he had become a Manichaean, she was devastated. To her, this was worse than all his sins combined. He had turned away from the truth and embraced a false gospel, one that denied the sovereignty of Christ. In her grief, she sought out a local bishop, desperate for advice. "Tell me what to do," she pleaded. "I fear my son is lost." The bishop, seeing her sorrow, smiled gently. "A son of so many tears," he told her, "cannot be lost forever." It was a prophecy she clung to, yet Augustine was far from ready to change. The world still had its hold on him, and so did his ambition. He set his sights on Milan, the political capital of the Western Roman Empire, where even greater opportunities awaited him. If Rome had made him powerful, Milan would make him unstoppable. But in Milan, fate awaited him in the form of a man whose words would shake his very soul. His name was Ambrose, a bishop unlike any he had ever met. Milan was unlike any city Augustine had ever known. It was the crown jewel of the Western Roman Empire, a place where power was forged not just by the sword, but by the tongue. Here, he was not just another scholar, he was a rising star. His mastery of rhetoric had already granted him prestige in Rome, but Milan would be his true battleground. He had been appointed professor of rhetoric for the imperial court, a position of high honor, one that brought him closer to the elite. This was everything he had worked for, everything he had sacrificed for. But fate had its own designs. It was in Milan that he first encountered Bishop Ambrose, the man who would change his life forever. At first, Augustine had no interest in Christianity beyond using it as a subject of debate. He still considered himself a Manichaean, still clung to the idea that divine truth could be found through intellect alone. To him, Christians were simple-minded, slaves to an unrefined and outdated faith. But Ambrose? Ambrose was different. Bishop Ambrose of Milan was not a weak-willed priest who spoke in dull, lifeless sermons. He was a man of unshakable authority, a scholar, a statesman, a defender of the faith who commanded respect even among Rome's elite. His words were like fire, burning away ignorance, leaving only truth. At first, Augustine came to listen out of curiosity, expecting to find flaws, to pick apart his arguments. But what he found shook him to his core. Ambrose did not simply read the scriptures, he breathed them. His words held a power Augustine had never encountered before. They were not just logical, they were alive. For the first time in his life, Augustine saw that Christianity was not the faith of the weak, nor the refuge of the uneducated. It was something deeper, something more profound than all the philosophies he had studied. Still, he resisted. Even as Ambrose's words stirred something inside him, his flesh clung to the life he had built. He had spent too many years chasing pleasure, too many years bound by the chains of his own desires. If he accepted the truth, it would demand everything from him. And so, he fought against conviction, just as he had always done. But something had shifted. Doubt had been planted in his heart. He no longer felt certain in his beliefs, no longer found comfort in the excuses he had once told himself. The sins that once thrilled him now felt empty. The pleasures that had enslaved him now sickened him, yet he could not let go. One day, after another sermon that left him shaken, he confessed to his friend, Alypius, "What is wrong with me? I know what is right, I know the truth, but I do not have the strength to follow it." Alypius, though not as troubled as Augustine, had begun to see the same truth as well. But still, Augustine stalled. He told himself he had time. He could convert later when it was more convenient. He wanted salvation, but not yet. He wanted to be free, but he would not release the chains. And so he lived in torment, trapped between what he knew and what he wanted. Then, one evening, he overheard something that shattered him. A group of imperial officers were speaking in hushed voices nearby, discussing the latest news. One of them, a high-ranking general, had converted to Christianity. This man had power, wealth, and status, everything Augustine still clung to. And yet, he had given it up to follow Christ. The soldiers marveled at the general's transformation, but Augustine felt something else entirely: shame. Here he was, a man who had spent years searching for truth, yet when he had finally found it, he hesitated. A soldier had the courage to surrender to God, but he, Augustine, did not. His pride, his pleasure, his excuses, none of them could justify his delay anymore. Something inside him broke. He turned to Alypius and said, "I can delay no longer. I must find a place to be alone." And with that, he left in a frenzy, his heart pounding, his soul in agony. He needed an answer. Augustine fled from the city's noise, his mind a battlefield, his soul caught between two worlds. He had spent years chasing wisdom, power, and pleasure. Yet here he was, crumbling under the weight of truth. He had argued against Christianity, mocked its followers, dismissed its teachings. But now, the battle was over. He could not deny it any longer. Yet he still could not surrender. His heart was divided, his will paralyzed. He wanted freedom from his sins, but he also wanted to keep them. He wanted peace, but he would not lay down his weapons. He had convinced himself that he could change later, when it was more convenient. But that lie had worn thin. He ran through the gardens of Milan, gripping his robe, gasping for breath. He collapsed beneath a fig tree, overcome with anguish. For the first time in his life, he wept. Not out of frustration, not out of intellectual confusion, but out of spiritual exhaustion. He had spent too many years fighting a war he could not win. And then, through the quiet of the garden, he heard it. A voice. "Tolle lege, tolle lege. Take and read, take and read." It was the voice of a child, distant yet unmistakable. He froze. He looked around. No one was there. The words had come from nowhere, and yet they struck him like a command from heaven itself. Take and read. His hands trembled. He understood. This was no ordinary whisper. This was a summons. He wiped his eyes, stood, and hurried back to the place where he had left his scriptures. Without hesitation, he seized the book, flung it open, and let his eyes fall to the first passage before him. It was from the letter of St. Paul to the Romans. Not in orgies and drunkenness, not in sexual immorality and debauchery, not in dissension and jealousy. Rather, clothe yourselves with the Lord Jesus Christ, and do not think about how to gratify the desires of the flesh. Romans 13:13-14. The words struck him like a blade. There it was, his entire life laid bare, the sins he had clung to, the pleasures he had chased, the excuses he had made. It was all there, and in a single moment he saw it all for what it was: worthless, empty, chaff in the wind. And in that moment he broke. He dropped the book, clutched his chest, and whispered, "It is finished." His resistance, his hesitation, his pride, all of it died beneath that fig tree. He rose a new man. He rushed to Alypius, his dearest friend, his fellow seeker of truth. Alypius saw his face and knew something had changed. Augustine spoke only one sentence: "I have found what I have been looking for." And with that, he renounced his former life. He left behind his mistress, not with bitterness, but with the solemn understanding that he was no longer the same man. He abandoned the dreams of wealth and status that had once consumed him. He went to his mother, Saint Monica, and for the first time he saw her not as an old woman trapped in superstition, but as the woman who had fought for his soul when he was too blind to fight for it himself. She wept, but this time her tears were of joy. Augustine was baptized by Bishop Ambrose soon after. The same man whose words had shattered his illusions now placed him beneath the waters of redemption. The transformation was complete. The war was over, and he had finally surrendered to the only king worth serving. Augustine had found the truth, but the journey was not over. If anything, his greatest trials were yet to come. Not long after his baptism, he decided to return to Africa, to the land of his birth. He would leave behind the halls of imperial power, the philosophers of Rome, the ambitions he once held. He no longer sought to be great in the world's eyes. He sought only to be faithful in God's. But he would not go alone. His beloved mother, Saint Monica, would accompany him. For years she had prayed for this moment, weeping over her wayward son, interceding for him with the persistence of a mother who refused to let the devil claim her child. And now, she saw him not as the lost boy she once mourned, but as a redeemed man. The burden was lifted from her heart. As they prepared to leave Milan, they stopped in the port city of Ostia, waiting for their ship to depart for Africa. It was there, in the quiet of their journey, that mother and son had their final conversation. They sat by a window, looking out at the sea, their voices hushed, their souls full of joy. "Son," Monica said, "my life no longer has a purpose on this earth. All I have prayed for has been fulfilled. My only desire was to see you return to Christ, and now my Lord has granted me this grace." Augustine listened, silent, sensing something in her words. "Why should I remain? What is left for me here?" she continued. "There is nothing I want from this world anymore." Augustine felt a sorrow creeping into his heart, but he did not fight it. Monica had lived her life for one mission: to see her son saved. And now that God had answered her prayers, she knew her time was near. Within a few days, she fell ill. Augustine sat by her side holding her hand, knowing that nothing, not philosophy, not logic, not even the wisdom he had spent years chasing, could stop what was coming. Her breathing slowed. Her lips moved in silent prayer. And then, at the age of 56, Monica passed away. Augustine buried her in Ostia, far from their homeland, far from the life she had known. But her journey had ended in victory. She had fought for her son's soul, and she had won. But Augustine's journey was just beginning. Monica's death left him grieving, but not broken. In the past, sorrow had driven him to despair, to pleasure, to escape. But now, he understood suffering in a new light. Her death was not an end, but a transition. From this world to the next, from the realm of time to eternity. She had been faithful until the end, and now she rejoiced in the presence of the Lord. Her passing did not lead him back to indulgence. It led him deeper into holiness. Returning to Africa, he renounced everything: his career, his wealth, his worldly ambitions. He formed a small community of men dedicated to prayer and study, living in simplicity, seeking only God's wisdom. But his solitude would not last. As his reputation for wisdom and holiness grew, the people would not let him remain hidden. They demanded that he serve the church, and so, against his own desires, he was ordained a priest. He preached, he taught, he wrote. His mind, once used to craft arguments against Christianity, was now wielded as a sword for truth. Years later, he was made the Bishop of Hippo, a role he never sought but accepted in obedience. He would spend the rest of his days defending the faith, teaching, writing, and guiding the church in one of its most turbulent eras. He became a voice that shaped Christianity for centuries. He became Saint Augustine. Augustine stood before the congregation, his voice steady, his eyes reflecting the weight of years spent in pursuit of truth. He had spent his youth chasing wisdom in the wrong places, filling his mind with philosophy but starving his soul. Now, as Bishop of Hippo, he spoke not from mere intellect but from conviction, from experience, from a lifetime of wrestling with God and finally surrendering to Him. The man who once dismissed Christianity as too simple now dedicated his life to unraveling its mysteries. His sermons were unlike any others of his time. He did not speak like a detached scholar or a distant priest, but as a man who had been in the trenches, who had lived in the darkness before finding the light. He understood the struggle of the human heart, the pull of desire, the temptations of the world, and the lies that ensnared the mind. And because he had once been enslaved himself, his words carried a force that shattered illusions. In the streets, men whispered his name with reverence and fear. Some still despised him, remembering his past life, refusing to believe a man so corrupted could truly be redeemed. But others saw the evidence. He had abandoned everything: pleasure, ambition, wealth, to serve God. And though he held power as a bishop, he lived humbly, wearing simple robes, fasting often, spending his days writing, teaching, and defending the faith against the heresies that threatened to consume it. One of his greatest battles was against the Pelagians, a group that denied the necessity of divine grace. They taught that man could attain righteousness through sheer effort, that he did not need God's help to overcome sin. Augustine, a man who had once been chained by his own will, knew this to be a lie. He had tried. He had tried for years to change himself, to break free from his vices through intellect and discipline, and he had failed. It was not until he surrendered to God's grace that he had been set free, and so he fought relentlessly against the idea that man could save himself, writing extensively on the absolute necessity of God's mercy. The world around him was crumbling. The Roman Empire, once unshakable, was beginning to fall. Barbarians had sacked Rome, chaos reigned, and many believed the end was near. Some pagans blamed Christianity, claiming that abandoning the old gods had brought destruction upon the empire. Augustine did not flinch. In response, he wrote one of the greatest works in Christian history, The City of God. He argued that the fall of Rome was not the end of the world, that no earthly kingdom could last forever, and that Christians belonged to a greater city, an eternal kingdom that no sword, no army, no empire could ever destroy. The world could crumble, but the kingdom of God would stand. His words carried across the empire, offering hope in an age of despair. They shaped Christian thought for centuries to come, influencing theologians, scholars, and rulers alike. He had once sought wisdom in pagan philosophy, and now he was providing wisdom that would outlive Rome itself. Yet, even as he wrote of eternity, his own time on earth grew short. Age had taken its toll. His once sharp eyes grew weary from years of writing. His voice, once commanding, softened with time. He had lived a life of relentless pursuit, first of pleasure, then of truth, and finally of God. And now his race was nearly finished. The Vandals laid siege to Hippo. The city burned, the streets were filled with fear, and Augustine, now an old man, lay on his deathbed. He asked that the Psalms of repentance be written on the walls of his chamber, that he might spend his last days reading them, meditating on the mercy of the God who had rescued him. As the fires of war raged outside as the empire fell to ruin, Augustine whispered his final prayers. He had once feared death, but now he welcomed it. He had spent years running from God, but now he was running toward him. And on August 28, 430 A.D., he breathed his last. The world he had known passed away. Rome fell, Hippo was conquered, the age of emperors faded into history. But the words of Augustine did not perish. His writings, his sermons, his prayers, his confessions, all remained, shaping Christianity long after his body had turned to dust. The man who once resisted God became one of his greatest defenders. The restless heart had found its rest. Augustine had left behind a legacy that would shape Christianity for centuries. His words did not die with him. His writings, copied by monks, preserved his wisdom for generations to come. His teachings on grace, sin, and the nature of God became foundational to Christian theology. The restless soul who had once wandered through philosophy, heresy, and indulgence had become one of the greatest defenders of the faith. His most personal work, the Confessions, became a spiritual masterpiece, a raw, unfiltered account of his struggle with sin and his eventual surrender to God. Unlike the works of philosophers who spoke from cold intellect, Augustine wrote from experience, from battle scars, from the depths of a soul that had been shattered and remade. It was not just theology. It was a testimony, an invitation for others to see themselves in his struggle. In it, he penned one of the most famous lines in Christian history. "You have made us for yourself, O Lord, and our heart is restless until it rests in you." It was the truth of his life. He had tried to find rest in knowledge, in pleasure, in ambition, in human love, but only in God had he found peace. And so his words, centuries later, still resonate. Even after his death, his influence only grew. He became a guide for scholars, saints, and theologians alike. His writings shaped the minds of men like Thomas Aquinas, influenced the doctrine of the Church, and provided strength to believers in times of crisis. His thoughts on grace would even fuel the debates of the Reformation 1,000 years later. But above all, his life stands as a testament to the power of God's mercy. If there was ever a man who had run from the truth, it was Augustine. If there was ever a man who had been enslaved by his own desires, it was him. And yet, grace had found him. It had pursued him through every detour, every sin, every excuse, and in the end, grace had won. His story is a lesson for every man who believes he is too lost to be found, for every soul that longs for truth but is too afraid to surrender. No one is beyond redemption, no heart is too hardened, no past too stained. Augustine had once prayed, "Lord, make me chaste, but not yet." In the end, he learned that delay in obedience only deepens the chains. He learned that true wisdom is not found in resisting God, but in surrendering to Him. For the one who clings to sin, for the one who doubts, for the one who fights against the truth, his life is a call to let go, to stop running, to return home. The world changes, empires rise and fall, but the words of Augustine remain. They are an echo of every human soul's longing, a reminder that no matter how restless the heart, it will never find peace until it rests in God.